Morning, good afternoon. Actually, Mr. Saeed Arikat and my co-host Noura Arikat, we are very delighted to be with you today. This is a very special recording in the studio, and it happens on the first day of 2024. Mr. Saeed Arikat will be addressing the question of questioning the State Department briefings on Palestine. And we are fortunate to have a first hand account from Saeed. This is part of the larger project of Gaza and Context teach-ins, although it is more of a podcast, and we will be addressing a number of topics with Saeed. But first, let me introduce my co-host, Noura Arikat, and let me just read something about Saeed's background before we move forward. But even before that, كيفك سعيد؟
And I'm fine. I'm doing great. Thank you for having me.
نورا أنت كيفك؟ How are you?
We're grateful to have this energy to continue this year with vision and force and to begin it in your company.
I am really, truly honored.
أهلا وسهلا. I'll say a few words about Saeed, and I'm going to condense your bio so that
Please,
because it's a very بنقول bio حافلي. It's packed with lots of accomplishments and experiences. Saeed Arikat has been the Washington bureau chief of the prominent Al-Quds Daily Newspaper and an adjunct professor at American University. Currently, his reporting centers around the United States Department of State. He is a frequent guest on Arab Satellite TV as commentator on U.S. politics and its foreign and security policies. From the summer of 2005, he served as the United Nations Chief Spokesman for Iraq and was based in Baghdad in 2005 to 2010. He traveled and worked in every region and city in Iraq and became ultimately intimately involved with the constitution and the 10 different national and regional elections that occurred during his tenure. Saeed holds a BS degree from the University of San Francisco and an MS degree from California State University in Long Beach. In this conversation, Saeed addresses comparatively his years of experience during foreign policy briefings, notably on Palestine at the United States Department for the most part, but as well as the White House. With focus on the current war on Gaza, we will feature heated exchanges, well, at least one, with Department of State representatives that became emblematic of strategies of evasion, double standards, and misinformation. Hello, Saeed. Hello, Noura. I will yield the mic to Noura for our first question.
Well, again, welcome. Thank you for being with us. And just for full transparency, despite the fact that we spell our names differently in English, you are my beloved uncle. I hope I am your beloved nibbling. But I wanted to start by situating who you are and your experience for people who now see you on the front line of questioning the state, questioning power, that your arrival to these briefings is a wayward arrival. That's not where you begin. We know that you were at CSU Long Beach as a designer on a different track. So can you tell us about how it is you come into journalism and now into this role as Washington bureau chief for Al-Quds?
Well, very quickly, because it's a long journey. But as you said, my background, I'm an industrial designer. I worked in Los Angeles for a number of years as an engineer and as a designer. And then we were always active. We always had Palestinian organizations in which I was very active in putting together and so on. It was the 70s and the 80s were a time when all Palestinians in America were basically well organized, and they were supporters either of this faction or that faction. And we created something, all the organizations that were around got together, and we created something called the Palestine Congress of North America, not to be confused with the one that they have today. It was an organization that basically it was launched strongly because it was launched by the main Palestinian political factions. And in 1981, I was basically elected to come and spend a few months in Washington and do work on behalf of the Palestinians. We did have an office on Wisconsin Street and so on. I mean, the group that I worked with in those days, it was Hisham Sharabi and Jawad George and so on, and Samih Farsoon and Nasir Arouri. We were all, and in fact, Edward Said was a member of the executive committee along with us, and so on. So, and Brahim Abdullah. So we had all these people that came together, and basically we set up this organization to advocate on behalf of the Palestinian cause. There wasn't really much advocacy because you always hit a brick wall in Washington in particular, but there was not much sympathy to the Palestinian cause at the time. And then, when things went very quickly into a major confrontation with in Lebanon, so you had the invasion in 1982. And ever since then, I was basically devoted to, journalism and politics. So that is the quick part of it.
So it became maybe a temporary position in Washington, D.C. on behalf of the PCNA, became now this new career that you've entered into.
Yes, I came, and I thought I would leave my job for a few months. And in fact, they called me time and time again. But once the invasion and Beirut was besieged, it was very difficult for anyone to leave what they were doing, especially that at the time, we were publishing two newsletters, one in Arabic and one in English. And the one in English, I worked with a very prolific colleague of ours at the time, Fawaz Turki. He and I produced one in English, and myself and a close friend, Adli Hawari, we did one in Arabic called Al-Haqiqa. And it was
were these distributed by mail?
It was distributed by what? Yeah.
By mail? Did you distribute
it to
members?
Of course, yeah. Everything was at the time by mail, yes. And we. I must say that I, as an active who advocated, or advocated against Arafat, so to speak. I don't want to go into any details.
You can share a little bit.
But Al-Haqiqa was really a newspaper that we distributed, and it talked about all the the shenanigans of the PLO, all the corruption that they were doing, both political and otherwise, and so on. It was a tool for us to express not an extremist position by any measure, but a real position that is reflective of where the Palestinian sentiment was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, an internal oversight mechanism is always necessary. Before we continue on to the briefings, I think it's important, because this has been raised many times historically, that the similarities between the siege of Beirut in 1982 and this current onslaught, I mean, nothing is comparable to a genocidal moment, but if it merits some mention about the similarities in the tactics and at least the desires, Israeli-American desires to rout out the PLO from Beirut, from Lebanon in 82, and now this fantasy of routing out Hamas militarily from Gaza in 2024 now.
Yeah, true. I mean, this is amazing. This pushing the Palestinians out. I was in Damascus in 1971. I just graduated from college, and I went there. It was at the time when the PLO was or Fatah was being thrown out of Jordan. The last battles of Ajlun, the mountains, and I saw the people at the time and so on. It was my first meeting ever with Yasser Arafat. I met him in his office in Damascus. We had a lengthy conversation. So it's so I really basically I followed these events of throwing out the Palestinians. So it was the only reason I bring this up is just to show that the PLO was always driven out. And so there was nothing new. And if you look at the rhetoric today, it's very similar. It's very similar. The same thing in Beirut. I mean, Beirut was attacked time and again, not one time or 3 times or 10 times. It was always being attacked. Major incursions and major occupations happened in 1978, then in 1981, and of course in 1982, and always the same thing. The word for word they use. So we are only targeting terrorists. We're only targeting this. And my wife Amna is whom I met right after she left Beirut in 1982. She was a physician in Akka Hospital, and They targeted the hospital where she was. Many of her colleagues were killed. She survived. But it was the same thing because, there were PLO terrorists in there. So what we heard about Shifa, what we heard about
النصر العودة.
all the hospitals and so on. Al-Ahli, I mean, this is where a major crime took place. It's exactly the same thing. So that always the target is to target the Palestinians by whatever form of expression they are.
I think it's also, just for us in our audience, this is a tangent, but in the aftermath of the siege of Beirut, the United Nations actually found that the massacre at Sabra and Shatila constituted a genocide. And there was a death toll of 3,000 who were brutally murdered after they were besieged.
It's probably a lot more, because I remember when Eli Habeka was asked about it, he said that you have to wait until Beirut digs a subway to know really how many Palestinians were killed. So, it is at least 3,000 people in Sabra and Shatila.
Fair. I should definitely note that. But that there, right, that here we get another example, yet again, historically in the law and jurisprudence, for those who cynically say that not enough Palestinians have been murdered in order to constitute a genocide, which is a failure to understand the jurisprudence or the legacy of the Genocide Convention. But let us move now to the present.
Okay.
You go from this moment, this happenstance experience in Washington, D.C. on behalf of the Palestinians, life-changing. And now in 2023 and 24, we see you on the front line of these press briefings.
Yes, absolutely. I've been covering the State Department and to a certain extent the White House. I used to cover the White House in 2001, 2002, and so on. I would go from time to time, and the Pentagon, because we was a one-man show. I still am. Yeah. So I did all this. So I've been covering them for a very long time. Except with that small brief period of 5 years. It's not a brief period, but for 5 years I was in Iraq. But yes, I am a regular at the State Department. I go every day. It really gives me material because, I am not, our resources are limited. So unless I really go and, sort of hound them, go after them to get something to write about, then, I don't have the resources that major news outlets have and so on. Yes, the briefing at the State Department, and the State Department, I must say, for my kind of reporting and my kind of newspaper is more important than the White House or the Pentagon, because it is not focused on one thing. The State Department is focused on foreign policy, and that really what concerns me as a reporter. So yes, I go there daily. It took me a long time to become, an authentic member of the State Department Press Corps. We have, and it's an important organization. And we have something called the bullpen, which is everybody has space, and I am one of them. There aren't many Arab organizations that have spaces, but I do. It took me a while to get it, but I do. And, I have my desk, I have my telephone. I pay for it. I pay for the telephone and for the internet. But yes, it is basically, for me, it's a forum to talk about the Palestinian cause, and to see what are the latest in terms of American policy, because the United States of America is really the one strong entity that determines in many ways the future of the Palestinians.
Absolutely. In a recent response, the Biden administration responded to the Center for Constitutional Rights, basically invoking their failure to prevent a genocide. The Biden administration's response said that even if the United States stopped supporting Israel, that Israel's genocide would continue. Obviously, they didn't call it a genocide, which we know is not true.
No, it is absolutely not true, because people like to say Israel is a sovereign state. We are unable to influence its policies and so on. This is so wrong on so many different levels, because for one thing, the United States of America provides Israel with $4 billion worth of arms every year. So, and of course, there's so many other different types of aid that goes from the United States of America is very complex. It's in the billions of dollars. It's in research. It's in sciences and so on. But with that alone, I mean, you can have a lot of influence. When if you give people $4 billion a year, and now we're talking about maybe additional 14 billion here and 14 billion there, who knows, and so on. So without a doubt, the United States is very influential. It could dictate its policy, I mean, on Israel, as it would other client countries. So, in many ways, Israel is a client state. It lives on an American umbilical cord. It not only in terms of arms, which is a major thing. I mean, people must remember that every bomb that is dropped on Gaza is an American-made bomb. Every Palestinian that is killed is somehow killed by an American-made bomb or shell or whatever, or artillery shell and all that stuff. Every airplane that Israel uses to drop bombs on Gaza is an American-made airplane. And it is really astounding when you look at this F-35, for instance, the most modern fighter jet on Earth. It costs $100 and something million. The only place where it was used is actually Gaza. Wow. It has not been used anywhere else, because even in Afghanistan, to the best of my knowledge, the United States has not used them. So, yes, the United States has a great deal of influence. They could influence it. They could, cut it off today, and they have. It's during the siege of Beirut.
It's just going to bring that up.
When there was a huge bombing, and Reagan, just could not take it anymore. And he was being briefed on what was going on, and he basically called Begin and called him Menachem. I mean, it's well documented, and the bombing stopped. So we know this happens. We know that it happened during the '73 war when the Egyptian Third Army was besieged by the Israeli army, and basically Nixon and Kissinger, they cut off all aid without consulting with Congress. So and they stopped. They stopped this the juggernaut that was being placed on the Egyptian Third Army that was about to be annihilated and so on. So and the United States, when even on the flip side of that, when the United States saw that Israel should not agree to a ceasefire, because that's what they wanted. Moshe Dayan and Golda Meir wanted a ceasefire. Early on in the October 1970, the Yom Kippur War, it was the United States that told, no, you're not going to have any ceasefire. We're going to supply you and supply you and supply you. And they created what was termed then and has been termed ever since as a bridge that, airplanes were just, landing every so many minutes or so many hours and so on with supplies and arms and so on. And they kept it going, which exactly what they did here. I mean, there are upward of 250, 260 airplanes that were laden with arms and ammunition that were sent. So to suggest that the United States, with all this influence, is unable to call for a ceasefire is, of course, defies logic.
It defies logic, also continues a campaign of misinformation from the White House down that has insisted on these frameworks. I mean, one of the things that CCR mentions is this instance of when Reagan calls up Menachem Begin and documents that within 30 minutes, Begin called for the ceasefire. So for us to... And it also brings into, clarity for a lot of people in the United States that this is not something happening far away. This is a U.S. war.
Right.
This is a U.S. war. And so there's a responsibility, even more of a responsibility to be paying attention. Before we get into this discussion of the substance of the discrepancy on who wants ceasefire now, I want to ask Bassam to bring up and share with us what you describe, you being at the forefront of bringing up Palestine and giving them a very hard, hounding them, as you said.
Yes, the record is really broad and intense of the exchanges that you have. And a lot of people actually wait for you to speak so that they can have, frankly, real journalism, the kind of journalism that we expect from journalists who are supposed to check power, not just reproduce and confirm power. And this is what you do. We have a clip we would like to start by showing this clip, and then we want to talk about how you have been able to manage and experience this particular moment during these press briefings. Should we do the clip now, or do you have any questions?
Let's
before-
go for it. We need to see the clip.
Okay. So this is you addressing spokesperson Miller at the State Department. It's a pretty long clip. We can cut it and then talk and then continue.
I don't have a comment on it. Go ahead, Said.
Thank you. I just want to follow up on Sean's question on the sanctions that against settlers and so on. There are many settlers, thousands of settlers, who hold U.S. passports. They are U.S. citizens. In this case, you cannot, of course, deny them a visa, but will you prosecute them if it's proven that they have participated in criminal acts?
Said, I would want to preview any action before it's taken, and certainly the State Department does not prosecute anyone, and I wouldn't want to comment but as you know, we have strict rules inside the United States government. Those decisions are made by the Justice Department. We don't comment on them or participate in them at any other agency.
Okay, so what kind of other sanctions you might?
Again, Said, I don't want to preview any steps that we might take. I will reiterate that our first priority is for the government of Israel to take action against those extremists who are committing violence against Palestinians. But we have options at our disposal as well that we will use if appropriate.
Okay, a couple of questions on Gaza. But before I ask on Gaza, today, I don't think you probably know about this, but there's a poet named Mus'ab Abu Toha, young poet. His son is U.S. citizen, born in this country. Abu Toha was a scholar at Harvard. Today he was leaving after speaking with the embassy, apparently, and he was trying to leave, and he was basically taken away and his toddler given to his mom and so on. Is there anything that his family should be doing with the United States, since more than likely he was probably on his way to the United States?
I don't have the details of that case, so it's very, let me establish the ground rule again. Okay. I will not interrupt your questions. Don't interrupt my answer, please. I don't have the details of that case, and so it wouldn't be appropriate for me to comment on them without having the full range of it, full details.
Okay, I'll send you the details now. Look, I mean, we have the figures are really gruesome. I mean, I don't know. Is this administration, and I say this with them, has it become numb to the number of Palestinians killed every day? I mean, are you okay with like 13,000 that have been killed thus far? Where are we going to stop?
Said,
where are we going to stop?
You have heard the president speak to this. You have heard the secretary speak to this. You've heard the secretary say that far too many Palestinians have been killed as a result of this conflict. Every innocent life that's lost is a tragedy, and we mourn the loss of every innocent life. These are civilians whose deaths have come through no fault of their own, that are in the conflict that is not of their own making. And I can tell you, speaking for myself, speaking for everyone in this administration, that we feel those deaths every bit as we feel the loss of Israeli civilian lives. And so that is why when we set out to develop our policies and have conversations with the government of Israel and with others in the region, we have a number of principles that we have made very clear. Number one, as Israel conducts a legitimate operation to prevent the terrorists that attacked it on October 7th from being able to do so again, it does so in accordance with humanitarian law, and it tries to the greatest extent possible to minimize civilian harm. Number two, we want to see civilians protected. We want to see civilian infrastructure protected. And number three, we want to get humanitarian assistance to those in need. That is what we can do at the policy level from the United States government. It's what we continue to do to try to minimize civilian suffering, to try to help those civilians who are in Gaza. But at the same time, we see every one of those deaths and we mourn each and every one of them.
The president said that, he envisions a Palestinian state that will include Gaza and the West Bank and so on. So let me ask you this. Or is it safe to assume that the administration has some sort of a vision how this very battle should end?
I don't want to get to how this conflict will end, because ultimately it's very hard to prescribe from a podium, it's hard to prescribe from a podium thousands of miles away how a military operation, which is of course unpredictable by its nature, we've seen that multiple times throughout history, how it will end, and what will be left in the aftermath. So where we are right now is laying out principles. And you've heard the Secretary articulate some of those principles with respect to Gaza, that there should be no diminution in the territory of Gaza, that no Palestinians should be displaced from Gaza, a number of other principles, and also heard him and the President articulate that ultimately at the end of this, we want to see the establishment of a Palestinian state that unites the West Bank and unites Gaza, so the Palestinian people can determine their own future. And that is the policy that we support. It's the policy that we will try to achieve.
Okay, so much there.
There's a lot going on. And we played the whole clip just so that we would like, frankly, as much as I would love to play more and more clips, we would love to hear from you. That's why we're not going to keep playing a lot of clips.
Right.
That's okay.
I mean, also for the sake of our health in this new year, these things are infuriating.
That's true. I must admit there are moments in the briefings, in the past that I thought it was very important because it did have an immediate impact, or effect. I remember in 2016, the deputy spokesman at the time, Mark Toner, right after the Obama administration had approved $40 billion. And the following day, an Israeli soldier took a bicycle from a 9-year-old girl and just threw it away. And I asked, and I said, is there a mechanism to deduct $100 from the $40 billion to compensate this girl for her bicycle? And they thought that I was being funny. I was not. I was serious. And I kept after it and so on. But lo and behold, a couple of days later, I think the Israeli Occupation Authority gave the girl a brand new bicycle. So it's, there are times that, it has elements. And there are times that are really just pure frustration because, you talk to them and they have already, they are predisposed in their position. They're not going to give me anything. They will keep repeating the same exact answers. I have been listening to the same exact rhetoric, boring, dull about the two-state solution, about all these things, about their feelings and their suffering and so on. I mean, the feeling of Palestinian suffering and all these things. But this does not change. But I have to keep on doing it because I have to raise these issues.
Well, I mean, obviously, again, there's so much there and we want to get into all of it. But first, let's raise another impact that people might not be aware of. Mus'ab Abu Taha, the day after your questioning of Miller, was released from detention. Yes. Right. And folks who weren't familiar with this, Mus'ab Abu Taha is the young Palestinian journalist in Gaza who was leaving with his 3 children and wife, kidnapped as he was exiting. His youngest son is a citizen, and detained, and just published the details of that detention.
Right.
Chilling details in an essay in the New Yorker. Right. And so much of it was an international campaign, but also we can't underestimate this direct confrontation on the record.
Right. Well, I think the large credit should go to the international campaign because that's how you really become effective. Mm-hmm. Of course, when you raise issues like this, that is embarrassing for the United States of America. And they like not to be confronted with this kind of embarrassment. They want to have it behind them. So if they can affect the situation, I think they will because to them, this is not a major thing. This is an embarrassment. They kidnapped a poet. They roughed him up, but at least he was released alive. And, not like many others who may not have.
But you bring up a good point. It's the difference between the specificity of these incidents, like the bike and Mus'ab, versus the abstract.
Right.
This is a genocide. That they can respond to you with a talking point in that moment.
Right.
As opposed to this instance.
I mean, there are, of course, every day during this war since October 7, I think the first briefing after October 7 was on October 10. And I can say, very confidently that, the Gaza or this war on Gaza takes up most of the oxygen in the room. I mean, not only me, but everybody else asks about Gaza and asks about U.S. Policy and so on. But there are moments that are just as dramatic. I mean, I will never forget the day Shireen Abu Akleh was shot. Mm-hmm. And I told she was sitting right here with us, which is true.
In the State Department.
In the State Department. She was in this room. I told them, that she was in this room and so on. And then they go around and, first of all, they parroting out the Israeli story, the Israeli narrative, that she may have been caught in a crossfire, may have been Palestinians and so on. And then you go on, and then they say, no, we have determined that it was an Israeli bullet. But then they come around, and then on July 4th, 2021, I think 2022, they came out, issued a statement on a holiday, July 4th, saying that sure, it was an Israeli soldier and an Israeli bullet, but the intention was not there. There was no intention.
Oh, I remember that letter. So embarrassing.
Of killing Shireen, and that's where it ended. So, that in many ways, that is just as painful as it is frustrating.
Obviously, 109 journalists have been shot dead in this moment. The Coalition for the Justice for Journalists has actually submitted their own petition to the ICC because of the systematic targeting, which reflects this lack of accountability. Can you imagine the lack of intention of a sniper shooting Shireen Abu Akleh between her ear and the tiny space under the helmet? I mean, that takes some audacity to lie so, boldly.
Well, we know how snipers work. I mean, I've read enough military history, and I've seen what happened in Iraq very closely and so on. And snipers work in a pair, too. They have a spotter and a sniper, and they always shoot one shot to figure out, the whatever velocities and inertia and air and wind and all these things and how it is affected. So they shot my colleague, Ali Smoudi, first, and his shoulder. Then they did the killing shot of Shireen Abu Akleh. So they know exactly what was going on. But this insistence, that they on the one hand uphold these standards of journalism and human rights, which is, now we know it, in many ways it's fraudulent, it's nonsense, it's malarkey in Biden's words. Exactly. It's a great deal of malarkey. And on the 20th of last month, Anthony Blinken held his last press conference for the year. And he came into the briefing room. They give 4 questions and so on. And normally we know who the questions are going to. And he basically said that you guys do a great job. And this year has been a hard year on journalism and so on. And we know that journalists get killed simply because they are doing their job. And then he says, in Ukraine and in the Middle East. As if, not 100. At the time, there was something like 90 or 95 Palestinian journalists had been killed and shot deliberately, but no mention that they were Palestinians, no mention that they had been killed by Israel. I mean, this is the hypocrisy. In
such a short period of time. Going back to this clip. So again, so much to unpack here. But before we get into the dynamic between Matthew Miller and you, who seems very annoyed to call out your name, but ready for you, just his, this commentary that they're insisting that Israel is proceeding according to the principles of humanitarian law or the laws that regulate armed conflict. At the same time that his very president explains that there are no red lines for Israel. How do these things make sense? I mean, you're there. How?
Yes, of course, and we raise these issues. I mean, they hold they hold that forum. They can, calling on any journalist is a courtesy. There is nobody has a right to. I mean, I can imagine that if they don't call on Matthew Lee, for instance, from AP, there would be an uproar. They have to call on him and so on. But at least, they are, when they call on me, it's courtesy. They can definitely not call on me. They don't have to. But if they do, then we are going to hold their feet to the fire. We're not going to let them get away with a lot of the junk that they say. Now, I know that they are governed by certain principles. And one of these principles is what Ned Price, of all the spokespeople, the spokesman that was before Matthew Miller. And I asked him one time, and he said that Israel's security is sacrosanct. And I mean, to me, that's what it is. Nobody's security is sacrosanct. What are you talking about? It's just like, if you're
a
holy believer, it's just like a holy thing. So these are the kind of things that they will always say. that when they talk about the laws of war, there are laws of war. Israel has never adhered to the laws of war. Nobody knows. I mean, and they don't adhere to the laws of the war either. The United States of America. They sent in just on Friday, last Friday, which was what I think the 29th of the month. 29th. My Friday was the 29th.
Yes, it was. Yes.
Yeah. So on Friday, Anthony Blinken authorized the shipment of $147.5 million in ammunition and so on, without even going to Congress, without abiding by the laws that are imposed on them. You're supposed to inform Congress that I'm taking this from my, pre-positioned armament and so on, and ammunition. Yes, yeah. So they don't abide by the laws of war. Israel does not abide by the laws of war, despite what they keep saying that Israel is the only democracy in the region, and it has a. I asked so many times, when there is when they say that Israel is investigating itself and so on, and I asked the same question. You have confidence in the veracity of Israel's ability to investigate itself, and invariably they say yes. Yet we know time and again they have not come clean on these issues.
No, but even when their investigations are complete, one, it's a willing and an unable and unwilling, and even when they have been willing, as they were in the Shireen Abu Akleh case, and they admitted culpability, there's really no consequence. And then in other situations where they're completely unwilling, especially when it's going to come to settlements and the idea of, but we could talk about that. But really quickly, just to add, 155 milliliter high explosive artillery munitions to Israel. That was the United States shipment on Friday, the day after South Africa requested provisional measures of Israel violating the Genocide Convention at the ICJ.
If I just may say something about the 155 millimeter shells.
Yeah.
I mean, these shells are designed to tear apart, and they are designed to destroy armors, and then they are designed for a battlefield situation and so on. They're not designed so you can, bombard residential areas, which is exactly what they are used for. I mean, we all know that the United States sends in these weapons everywhere. They send them to Ukraine when they did not have them to have enough of them to send to Ukraine. Back in July, they send them cluster bombs, which most people know what cluster bombs are, and so on. So this is the kind of behavior and conduct that the U.S. had done time and time again.
Cluster bombs that the Reagan administration actually imposed sanctions onto Israel again after 82. The legacy, this continuing legacy. Sorry, Bassam.
I just wanted to take us into a sort of a technical area for a second. Can you just tell us a little bit about the craft, the mechanics of how these briefings take place as we continue talking about them? Do these representatives have talking points like that they have to adhere to? And then what sort of leeway do they have? What kind of range of freedom do they have? And is it that it depends on the actual representative to sort of bring up what they feel or what they think is right, or how constrained are they, and how does that allow you, the journalist, to push further?
That's a great question because yes, absolutely, they are restricted, and there are moments in that briefing room in the State Department that is really. I mean, the spokesman took a very courageous stand and just walked out, like with Bernard Kalb, for instance. The Kalb brothers, I don't know if you know, the Kalb brothers were CBS News people, and they were, very prominent. I think Marvin's still around at Brookings. But Bernard Kalb was the spokesman for Reagan, for Schultz, George Schultz, the Secretary of State, during the Reagan administration, most of the Reagan administration. And they'd had a disinformation campaign on Libya, to attack Libya in 1986. And he had a prepared statement to say, and basically he could not say it. And he put it there, and he said, I will not do this, and just walked out and left that job So that there are moments like this that happened in the press room, but very rare, very few. You don't see people walking away or saying I beg to differ. PJ Crowley, another spokesman under Hillary Clinton, also said something about on television, and they fired him basically for what he said. He said that he accused the government of being stupid for attacking Syria and attacking Libya and doing all these things. That was when in 2011. So he lost his job because he basically stated the obvious on what the U.S. was doing and all these things. But by and large, to answer your question, you go in, we I'll say this: the United States of America, or the State Department in the Department of State, which is what they would call everywhere else the Foreign Ministry. The Department of State is probably the only place where they have regularly scheduled news briefings. This is not found anywhere else. They do it from time to time. We know that the Russians started doing it with Maria Zakharova since the war in Ukraine and so on, but it's still interrupted. You can't find this in Paris. You can't find this in the Foreign Office in London. You have from time to time you have an occasional briefing, but the one place that has consistently held news briefings on daily basis is basically in Washington, in the State Department, in the White House, and in the Pentagon. So you have this thing daily that allows journalists like me or any other to basically, first of all, it allows them access to be able to ask these questions, and they do call on you. This is one thing to their credit. They do call on you time and again, despite sometimes you being contentious and so on. And I know, there I don't want to mention names, but there are journalists that are very contentious. They go there just to sort of stir the pot. Some of them I'm sure you know.
Well,
So
you're doing that too.
I stay. I'm out there not to provoke. I'm out there to really probe into an issue that is is right out there. You cannot ignore it. When you talk about the building settlements, and you keep saying we are against settlements, so what are you? And the natural question is, what are you doing to stop Israel from building settlements? What are the consequences?
It's kind of the same situation with what are you doing to stop the bombing and to actually
right, absolutely. But even something like this on the settlement, you say you're committed to the two-state solution. You say that settlements are an obstacle in the achievement of the two-state solution.
Since 67,
but you don't do anything. You don't impose any sanctions. You don't punish Israel and so on. The only thing on the issue of the settlement that we talked about, for instance, they said we are going not to allow settlers, those settlers who are involved in violence, to allow them to enter into the United States of America. And my natural question was, and that's what he really hated, was that half of these guys are U.S. born, U.S. citizens. Exactly. You cannot prevent them. And then how are you going to prosecute them? He said, well, this is a Department of Justice issue. It's not a State Department issue. But the fact of the matter, a lot of these marauding settlers are Americans. They have American weapons. They say we stopped the shipment, but in fact, that weapon was these weapons were distributed by Ben Gvir and so on. So the issues are endless. But to their credit, they allow you this space. You are notified in advance that whether the briefing is going to be held or being late, whether it's a minute or 10 minutes or a half an hour or the end of the day and so on. But so there's consistency here, and during the Trump administration, we were without a spokesperson for months. They just didn't want to have spokespeople because, they thought that foreign policy ought to be run from the White House. And by and large, it is run from the White House.
I was just going to ask you about that right now.
Yes. Yeah. So,
can I pose that question?
Yes, absolutely.
So as somebody, I imagine your proximity, not just as a journalist, but also to information that the rest of us aren't privy to. We know that there's been at least six memos of dissent from within the State Department who have objected to the American handling of this ongoing genocide.
Right.
No less than 6. And yet at the same time, the State Department, which as you described, the foreign ministry, which is supposed to oversee, some sort of diplomacy
Right.
on these issues, has not been as effective in overpowering what seems like a locus of decision-making
Right.
on this between Biden, Blinken, and Brett McGurk, very notably.
Right.
What is your assessment of this?
That's a very good question. I will tell you, it's the State Department is responsible for agreeing to approving weapons that go anywhere in the world.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the State Department that actually approves weapons and the transfer of weapons from the United States of America to any other country. They send it to Saudi Arabia, they send it to Egypt, and so on. And they have a review process. Why did Josh Paul, for instance, resign? Josh Paul was responsible for sending the weapons, approving, because he says, we can't allow this malarkey, this garbage to go on. When we know that they are not abiding by the laws of war, we know that they are using this weapon to actually inflict injury and destruction on innocent people, and that's why he resigned. He just could not take it. They will not change their policy. They're not going to change their policy. And just to add to what you're saying, it is really in the State Department there are hundreds, and I'm not exaggerating. There are hundreds of employees at all levels that are opposed.
Oh, yeah.
And not only opposed, but opposed in the strongest possible of ways to this war. They call for its end. They call for a ceasefire, and the same thing in the USAID, and many other agencies. But for sure, there is a clique. I think there's a small clique that runs this show, and it is the White House, and it's the Pentagon, and it is the State Department. I think that, the Deputy Secretary of State is a well-known neocon, Victoria Nuland. She's married to a well-known neocon, Robert Kagan, and the Kagan, his brother, Frederick, his father. They're well-known. They were advocates of the war on Iraq, So this group wants wars to be continuing. They played a tremendous role in the war on Ukraine. It's a different issue. I don't want to delve into it, but much of what we have seen happen in Ukraine, especially in 2014, was probably the brainchild of Victoria Nuland and Robert Kagan and these guys. So yes, this group wants to see dominance of the United States of America or its proxies. Not only so, Israel is a great part of their vision, and the neocons they began by actually designing a policy for Netanyahu in 1996. That's how it all began. It was not for the United States of America, but then it was when Netanyahu won.
This is not the vision for a new century.
Right, no, the vision of the new century. Yes, of course, but it evolved, it morphed into that. I'm saying it began by basically having a plan for Netanyahu to win and undo Oslo. That's how it began. With Bill Kristol and all the other clown, Paul Wolfowitz, and all the others, and so on. So that's how it began.
So they wanted to. So it was from within the United States a desire to unravel Oslo.
Oh, you bet.
Even though Oslo was a trap for Palestinians and created an autonomy framework that would never lead to a state, wasn't it in U.S. interest to maintain this liberal fiction?
No, if you look at people like John Bolton, for instance, or Richard Perel, if you recall, Richard Perel, or Bill Kristol,
of course, these are all
or
notorious
Danielle Plitka. I can go on and on. I know them all. So these guys were all opposed to Oslo because they think that you are legitimizing the PLO. You are legitimizing, a process that might lead to a Palestinian state, because they feel that the moment you have a Palestinian state, no matter where, then, what claim to legitimacy does Israel have? If you want to recognize the Palestinians as a national entity, you automatically lose your argument for what legitimacy do I have. And if you are to give Judea and Samaria, which is really the biblical claim, how can we defend Israelis in Akka, Haifa, and other places, and so on. I mean, this is where the Bible.
So that any recognition of the Palestinian undermines the status quo of Israel's recognition as a state.
Legitimacy.
Yeah.
Legitimacy, absolutely.
Its recognition as a UN member state since 49.
These guys have always, what we have seen during the Trump administration, we have seen a feeling, a euphoria around town among, the neocons and Israeli lobby organizations, whether it's the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy or AIPAC, when they say, well, this is it. This is the moment. This is to really liquidate the Palestinian issue. We want the Palestinians to surrender. They all said that. And they kept going to Congress, in these briefings to say that Palestinian refugees, which is the linchpin of, the Palestinian Nakba, the Palestinian refugees are only 60,000, 30 to 60,000, and those can be accommodated. So ultimately they wanted the Palestinians to surrender, to give up their right to Palestine, and so on. So all along, the neocons, and the group that is so well connected to the military-industrial complex and so on, they have, espoused these kinds of ideas. Now, some, very strong advocates within the Israeli lobby, like Dennis Ross and so on, may not be a neocon, but he advocates on behalf of Israel 100%. He will, he was I think he was called during the negotiations by Aaron Miller, Aaron David Miller, who is now in Carnegie, but they were all negotiators at the time. He called him Israel's lawyer, They are, So, and then you also have someone like Martin Indyk and so on that believe or claim to believe that there's a two-state solution. But among this group, none of them do.
I wonder how, though, if the recognition of the PLO on its very face, the recognition of Palestinians, even absent the state, doesn't that do the same to undermine the legitimacy argument? Because if there is a Palestinian people,
right,
which is a juridical recognition,
right,
that means that they have sovereignty that's been denied.
Yes, I mean, there is a dilemma there. Now, bear in mind that the PLO is still, by Congress, defined as a terrorist organization. That's why they were able to close the office in 2018 and throw out, the ambassador at the time, Hussam Zumlot from Washington under that designation. So, every so often they have, or every 6 months, they needed to issue a waiver or to renew that waiver and so on. So the PLO until today is basically designated as a terrorist organization. Now, in an event that is so huge, like to call it an event is probably wrong, this horrendous war of genocide that is happening, one thing that came out of this until now is the fact that the Palestinian issue is back on the front burner. That's, because they know that you cannot just get rid of the Palestinians. You are not unable to get rid of them, despite calls. I mean, what Smotrich did, says, yesterday or the day before yesterday, he said that we can do with 100,000 to 200,000 in Gaza. The rest should go to, to Sinai or wherever they want to go.
Wherever people take them,
Can you tell us a little bit about something we talked about before, which is you and I talked about before, which is the potential or the real difference between a Republican and a Democratic sort of establishment in terms of these press briefings?
Interesting. I during the Bush administration, early on, it's simply because they were trying to cater to Arab journalists and so on. We had a great deal of access. I mean, there was not a day, October and on. I mean, right after when the bombing began in Afghanistan, there was not a day that would go by in which we did not speak to Powell, for instance. They have something called the stakeout, and the stakeout, every time that they had a visitor, and there's always a visitor, some sort of a foreign minister or dignitary and so on. And Powell, and before him, the others did the same thing. They would walk them out to the door, and the journalist would be right on the main door, right around the main door, and he would come and talk to us. So we got to know him almost on a daily basis. And I would ask him a question almost every day. They went out of their way to invite me and a couple of others for roundtable discussions from time to time. Powell would do it, Armitage would do it, his deputy, and so on, and it would be myself and like Hisham Milham and Salam and Ahmad and others and so on, and they would, we would ask them about Iraq, about Palestine, about whatever. So they were, in that sense, they were far more accessible. As far as my own personal experience, the Republicans were more accessible as far as their policy on the Palestinian issues. I think that what we have seen during the Bush administration is one thing, because they wanted to use Palestine as a cover for attacking Iraq, occupying Iraq, destroying Libya, doing all these things, and so on. So the Condoleezza Rice was frequently would give me interviews and would give me questions and so on. Would be invited to her office, as a matter of fact, and so on. So they were that accessible. But of course, as we say بالعربي لغرض في نفس يعقوب, for a different intention altogether. The Democrats, the Democrats are, democratic. I'm talking about in terms of access on the Palestinian issue and so on. Yeah, in the briefing, I had all the access I want. I remember that with P.J. Crowley, who was a good, decent man and so on, he would always give me the space that I wanted. With Victoria Nuland, to her credit, she would give me, and I would go on and on and on. I would really exhaust the questions and all these things. So in terms of courtesy, Jen Psaki, the same thing. John Kirby was always the same thing. They were courteous. So, but their position on Palestine is somewhat different, So we, for 4 years of Trump, for instance, not only they walked away from the two-state solution, for instance, but also they wouldn't even acknowledge that it is occupied, And I asked this many times, and they wouldn't come back to you. Is this an occupied territory or what? They of course acknowledged Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights and so on, and of course the Jerusalem, the same thing. So we have seen that the Trump administration has taken a very anti-Palestinian position. I don't know if this war had taken place under them, but at least their position, their political position, was very clear. When Pompeo was a well-known pro-Zionist kind of Secretary of State. He is, fiercely pro-Zionist. He was so proud of having having a bottle of wine named after him and so on, and all these things, and
the settlements,
the settlement named Trump. He had a settlement named after him. So in that respect, there's the difference is basically cosmetic. The Democrats do adhere that we want a two-state solution. We want to recognize the Palestinians. Somebody came up with a term that we want to have the Palestinians and the Israeli experience the same level of dignity. I think it was Hadi Amr that came up with that, and so I don't know, but I suspect that it was. So they kept touting this, all throughout. That's what they were saying. We want the Palestinians to have the same measure of dignity. And I always ask the same question. So how would you have someone that is subject to checkpoints and imprisonment and inability to move from point A to point B, have their home destroyed if they have done any kind of protest and so on, with others that live better than anyone else in Europe, for instance. They have a high standard to live in, have a great deal of ability to move about. They have their own roads and all these things. So they come up with these terms that shows that they are at least at least committed to some sort of a Palestinian resolution. I'm talking about the Democrats.
Given the fact that, the Biden administration and actually the Democratic National Committee, even before Biden, won in this election, had said that there would be no return of the U.S. embassy from Jerusalem to Tel
Right.
Aviv, indicated that so much of it is in fact cosmetic, that they've continued to talk about it out of both sides of their mouth. Like you said, right?
Right.
They want the Palestinian state, they want an end of settlements, but on this side of their mouth
Right.
are providing these billions, the
Right.
lack of impunity, military intelligence
Right.
in this instance. I want to go back to something
The
that
political cover. I mean, this is the worst thing is the political cover, which the United States gives Israel, and
This veneer.
globally.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I want to go back to something that you said about the glee of the neocons as captured by AIPAC
Right.
and others. You reported recently that U.S. intelligence has indicated that Hamas's popularity is not only grown amongst all Palestinians, right? Even, those supposedly that Israel wants to rebel against Hamas in the Gaza Strip by massacring them.
Right.
But not only amongst all Palestinians, but even globally.
Right.
So how does that square? I mean, isn't this counterproductive to their own intentions of a final victory for Israel, which in fact is likely to be the exact opposite of what they intended?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, since day one, this administration basically came out carrying, the same Israeli goals and slogans and so on. The decapitation of Hamas, the hunting of their leaders and so on, changing the regime in Gaza so they couldn't be done again, and freeing the hostages, which, none of these goals have been achieved, not even
Zero.
one. There is nothing to show for it. So, and the fact that Hamas, obviously for obvious reasons, I mean, it sounds oxymoronic, but for obvious reason, Hamas is fighting and defying this horrendous occupation machine, this amazing onslaught, this massive bombardment, and so on. So people feel that someone is saying, enough to the Israelis, these excesses, these crimes, these horrendous war crimes, and all these things. So it is, in their view. I mean, and you listen to all the analysts that are either close to the administration or not so close to the administration. People that, I run into them all the time simply because I operate out of the same area geographically. I run into someone like John Alterman, for instance, from time to time, and because he has coffee at the place where I have coffee, and they know that Hamas's popularity is growing because they are putting up a good fight in their view. They're putting up their ability. They have not. Hamas has never carried out one single operation or a terrorist operation outside of historic Palestine.
And that matters a lot.
And
that matters a lot, especially for those who insist on removing this entire moment from history
Right.
and making Hamas float as if it was an equivalent to ISIS and not rooted on this land as a nation sovereign. But isn't this ironic here that, in fact, what we're seeing is, rather than, despite all of Israel's use of grotesque force and indiscriminate targeting and disproportionate tactics, that they are actually becoming more weak. And that weakness is indicated by their need to use more coercive measures. I mean, even in the United States, that you need universities in order to ban student groups from speaking, I think, reflects the crumbling of Zionist, any kind of, cachet that it had, but also just Israel in general, that this is all counterproductive to its purposes.
Yes, absolutely. Look, no matter how you probe what happened on October 7, it did some amazing things in terms of impact. It has basically shattered the invincibility of this Israeli army, الذي لا يقهر, this that cannot be defeated. And they also shattered their intelligence, which was, touted as the intelligence that doesn't sleep. That's their slogan. They were able to do it. And yesterday there was a very lengthy report in the New York Times on how it was actually done. And it was far more sophisticated than thought earlier, and so on, and how they did it. So this definitely, in the third world and among the Arabs, let's say, among the Palestinians first, but the Arabs and Muslims that see these people are, they are the ones that are aggrieved. They are the ones that are,
Mm-hmm.
repressed and oppressed and so on. And they are able to fight back because they have a cause to believe in. They are fighting for their own cause. On the other hand, what we see that the Zionist cause, must resort to all kinds of tricks and treachery and so on, preventing students from working on campuses, defaming somebody's character and so on because they dare to speak, throwing people from their jobs. I mean, there are so many in America and in Europe and other places. There are people that lost their jobs
For saying
in
ceasefire
Germany, for
now.
example. For doing a post or something like this. So there are resorts, and it is really desperate in many ways. That is a desperate effort. I think that what we saw and the fact that this war has gone on for 3 months almost, for almost 3 months.
Genocide.
This genocide, but also for the Palestinian resistance to be able to fight and continue to fight and continue to inflict damage and destruction on these amazing machines that the Israelis use in their oppression endears them, and they make them respectable in the eyes of all the people across the region and so on. They make their own weapons. And I remember that Bill Burns went to the Senate and he was asked about Iran. Iran is supplying them with weapons and so on. And he basically said that 90% of their weapons are homemade and so on. So when people see this, they see, Muslimin, they are the ones who are Muslimin.
Yes.
They're oppressed and targeted and all these things. Then it is obvious that people will have a certain empathy towards them. It's not coming from the West. It's going to come from the region.
Well, it might very well, because as far as Israel is concerned, the ICC and the ICJ. Oh, the ICC is anti-Semitic.
Right.
The ICJ is participating in blood libel. Everybody, all Palestinians who speak are liars and are brainwashed by their parents. I mean, there is. We see this limit, particularly amongst a generation that won't have it. That's getting their own information. That the show is up as far as they're concerned. Let me flip it back, because our time is limited, to your experience. You mentioned you're a one-man show, not just on behalf of Al-Quds, but also in terms of representing this very line. If you want to give us a little bit more texture about what does this look like for Palestinians to be on the front line, I think very much of Helen Thomas, who did something very similar at the White House for many years before she had her own, what they would call a fall from grace, if you want to share with folks who don't remember that and the legacy that you continue.
And right before you share that, I want to also share that there is a viewer who just said exactly that on YouTube, that Saeed Arikat is clearly a worthy successor to the formidable, no-nonsense, failure-like persistence of the great Helen Thomas. So this is on people's minds, and you're appreciated in that way.
Well, it's a great honor. I would never even claim to come close to Helen Thomas. I mean, she is really in a league of her own. She was right up there in the front all the time. We all learned from her. I am honored to have known her and, from time to time, see her and spend time with her. But by no means I am even close or in that league. So that said, and I say this truthfully, I'm not just saying this. It is true. She was someone different. She was a great writer. She was an amazing journalist, and she had a forum that is far more effective than my forum. I am a Palestinian who writes in Arabic for a newspaper that is so far away, and all these things, has so many problems of its own. The problem, Bassam, the problem with my situation is there are no other Palestinian journalists. I mean, that work where there are many Palestinian journalists that work for other outfits in Al-Arabiya, Al Jazeera, others, and so on. But for a Palestinian organization or a Palestinian news organization, there is none. And if they don't come to the briefing. And if they do come to the briefing, they don't ask the questions. Or if they ask the question, they don't frame it properly and so on. So we have issues. I mean, I am the oldest one in the briefing. There's only probably one person older than me. So I want to see young people come. I mean, there are There are non-Arabs that ask great questions all the time. I mean, I could cite people from Reuters, people from Anadolu, people from, AFP. They always ask good questions and so on. But these people, they're not Palestinians. They don't, report back to a Palestinian organization. So there is a huge need for people to come and be there and ask the right question and not be timid. It can be intimidating. It can be intimidating for a number of reasons. You look differently, you speak differently, your accent is different, and so on. There are so many things. You have not done your homework, but if you have to do it, if you do it day after day after day after day, then you learn the ropes, and you can ask the proper questions, and you know how to ask the proper questions. And always, my questions are short. They're many and repetitive, and I don't back down just simply because somebody gave me an answer. But you don't make a statement. My advice to people come to me from other news agencies and say, we want to be as we want to do what you're doing and so on. And I always tell them to go learn from the very best, from Matthew Lee and others and so on. But if I were to give them advice, don't give a lecture. I mean, this is the thing. I mean,
which was the problem in the 80s and 90s on
and
television.
Still is. I mean, my colleagues from places like Bangladesh or Pakistan and so on, and you can see that there are so many people, and everybody has a question. Everybody wants to ask a question. So going back to the fact that I am a one-man show, it is true. It is true in that respect. I mean, there are times when I have colleagues from Al Arabiya and Al Jazeera asking some questions, but not as frequently as they should in the State Department.
I want to ask a last question, but before I ask that, do you have, Noura, anything to address?
No, I think I'm ready for the last question.
Are you ready for the? Okay.
I think I might be ready, yeah.
But I'm not ready for it. I need to formulate it. No, I'm joking. All right. Okay. So my last question is, it's the same question I ask when we talk about Gaza and when we talk about the current onslaught to various people that I speak with. Do you see that this particular war, this particular slaughter that we're watching and its reverberations in the United States, politically, socially, and as well as in the media landscape, do you consider it to be a potential marker for some sort of significant, if not tectonic, shift in terms of the legitimacy of the United States, the legitimacy even of the spokespersons, because we follow the comments on C-SPANs or elsewhere on the internet. It's remarkable how in the last, say 80% or 75% time-wise, like basically from the end of October until today, the shift has been so dramatic in terms of the average viewers. We're not talking about people who are squarely in one camp, who are responding and in this belief as to how spokespersons respond to you or others when they get asked questions. Do you find that this will constitute a significant shift in the future, or will it be business as usual the moment the hostilities and the killing stops?
I don't think that things will be business as usual because of the. This is a very profound moment in many ways. It's a very profound event in its impact and in the level of the atrocity that Israel is committing, and the level of support. I mean, we have seen the President of the United States come out and repeat a story that is a lie, a pure lie, and so on, time and time and time again, which is not befitting of the office of the presidency. We've seen the Secretary of State do the same thing, the Secretary of Defense do the same thing, and so on. But at the other level, I mean, you can. If I had some sort of a gauge to measure how my colleagues in the State Department feel, that my journalist colleagues and so on, you could see the shifting. They could see the frustration, because everyone sees what's going on. Everybody sees it. I think that this moment and its political implications for this president and for the Democratic Party is huge. It is huge. It's going to be Gaza for the first time, as a foreign policy issue, will have a tremendous impact on the presidency or on the campaign. You know, Americans vote their pocketbook. That's what they say. We vote our pocketbook. They vote the economy and so on. But I think this time around, Gaza will have a tremendous impact, and people are, they're sick of this, criminal Israeli behavior, and this amount of slaughter, this amount of destruction. When you talk about, 70% of Gaza is destroyed. People talk about the killing of Palestinians as if, they don't matter. Their life does not have any value. I think, yes, this moment will have a great deal of impact on the not only on the future of this administration, but also in terms of organizing politically in America for years to come, because the First Amendment is at risk. The First Amendment is at stake.
Yeah. To be continued about how, and I've noted this before, the irony of a minority in the United States that would want to actually work against its interests by clamping down on the First Amendment. But here we are on this horizon.
Any last words, Saeed, that you'd like to leave us with? Or I really appreciated you addressing younger journalists who are entering the field. Is there anything that you'd like to close with, including on this last issue?
I think that journalism is a great profession. I mean, people should pursue it. It doesn't really pay well unless you are a star, and there are many stars in journalism. But if you believe in these issues, whether it's human rights or political rights, civil rights, whatever it is, and you feel that you can sort of convey this message and then in turn convey it back to your readership, you've done a great job.
Okay.
And you've done the best of that job. Thank you for the work that you're doing, particularly in this moment, and for the decades of work that you've offered us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Saeed Arikat, for joining us. We are very happy that actually a lot of people had, some comments and questions. We will not actually entertain them because I promised you about 75 minutes and we're already over that. So thank you very much. And thanks, Noura, for being a remarkable interlocutor. And to everyone else, feel free to join us next week as we resume our teach-ins on PalestineInContext.org, where you can find all the teach-ins, the podcast, an extended list of solidarity statements archived and categorized, as well as the film Gaza in Context, and soon the curated module on Gaza, which includes readings that are available to anyone, but particularly instructors who wish to use this material for assignments. Shukran كثير. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Shukran.
All right.